Dateline, Salt Lake Democrat, March 30th, 1885. Quote, "We are now prepared to receive orders for Celebration Budweiser Lager beer. Special inducements given to purchasers of carload lots. Having given our careful attention to the selection of the finest material for the manufacture of beer after the Budweiser process, we are in a situation to place before the public an article superior to any hitherto offered in this market. Orders by telephone promptly attended to. Signed, Jacob Moritz, Secretary and Treasurer." End quote. I'm Wendy. This is Demolished Salt Lake, and the story of the Salt Lake City Brewing Company. Hello, and welcome to episode 8. So I am fascinated with the intersection of history and lore. I love lore. I love folklore, origin stories, ghosts, and the paranormal. I've done my share of paranormal investigations, and I've delved deep into stories of hauntings in historic places. I think lore is a really important part of our collective narrative. But where lore can go wrong is when it replaces actual history and historic events. There are a few really good examples of this, such as the Winchester Mystery Mansion in San Jose, California, and the Myrtles Plantation in St. Francisville, Louisiana, where in both cases, the lore has been accepted as factual truth, and finding the real history takes some digging. As for us here in Salt Lake, we have a few places where this intersection takes place. One is the Mausoleum of Jacob Moritz in the B'nai Israel Cemetery within the Salt Lake City Cemetery. At some point after Jacob was laid to rest, someone associated the name Emo to his gravesite, and the lore was born. The story goes that if you circle this particular mausoleum 3 times while chanting the name Emo, then look into the window of the mausoleum, you would see red glowing eyes or the face of Emo staring back at you. The story varies depending on who you talk to. Unfortunately, because of this, the grave has been vandalized over the years, and the window that once looked into the mausoleum is now covered with a steel plate, and Jacob's remains are no longer there, having been moved years ago. Many generations of kids, including me, grew up knowing this only as Emo's grave, and not knowing the true story of Jacob Moritz, which is sad because he played a really important part in Salt Lake history and deserves to be known for who he was and what he did. So this episode is dedicated to the true story of Jacob Moritz and the Salt Lake City Brewing Company. Now grab a beer, I've got a Hefeweizen, sit back, relax, and let's talk some brewing history. Cheers. The Salt Lake City Brewing Company was established in the mid-1870s around 10th East and 500 South in Salt Lake City. Depending on which history you read, it was known as the Jacob Moritz Brewery, Moritz and Company Brewery, Salt Lake Brewery, Salt Lake City Brewery, and the 10th Ward Brewery. No matter what name it was called, it would not have seen such huge success without Jacob Moritz. Jacob was born in Germany in February of 1849. His father Isaac was a merchant and hotel proprietor and possibly influenced Jacob to graduate from a business college in Mannheim, Germany, and enter into a career in business. He emigrated to the United States in September of 1866 and secured employment with the F.M. Schaefer Brewing Company in New York. He spent a couple years there expanding his knowledge of brewing, and then made his way to the Anheuser-Busch Brewing Company in St. Louis, Missouri. He was only there for a short time before heading to Helena, Montana to try his hand in the mining business. He didn't last long in Montana and arrived in Salt Lake City in early 1871. Once here, he started the Montana Brewery near where Warm Springs Park is today on 300 West. In 1875, Jacob purchased the interest of Mr. Richter and Mr. Jonasson in the 10th Ward Brewery, of which he was brewmaster and manager. He formed a partnership with Aaron Keyser that ran until 1881, when Keyser's interest was purchased by Matthew Cullen, and the firm name was changed to Moritz and Cullen, and later the Salt Lake City Brewing Company. Matthew Cullen played a very important role in the success of the brewery, and you'll hear more about him as we go throughout the episode. Now, about the name 10th Ward Brewery. I've talked about this in previous podcasts, but as a refresher, in 1849, Salt Lake City was divided into 19 LDS church wards for leaders to better manage the growing population of the city. The 10th ward was one of the most sought-after areas of the city. Its boundaries were 300 south to 600 south and 600 east to 1300 east. It was known as the Ward of Industry, with a planing mill and a lumber mill, a shoe factory, Troy Laundry, and a bakery. But by far, the largest employer was the brewery. Shotgun-style cottages built on East Place and Windsor Street, just west of the brewery, reportedly housed the workers, including German immigrants, while nicer homes on nearby Fletcher Court housed the management. As for Jacob, he and his wife, Lahila Lewison, who was born in Honolulu, Hawaii, lived in a 2-story brick Italianate side passage-style house at 975 East, 400 South, just down the street from the brewery, making for a very convenient commute to work. Now, spoilers, this house was demolished sometime before 1966, when the apartment buildings that still stand there today were built. While we're talking about houses, I want to mention Matthew Cullen's house at 941 East, 500 South. This house was originally built in 1879 by Aaron Keyser. This is a 2-story brick and stucco house on a sandstone foundation in the Gothic Revival style. Keyser chose this site because it was next to the office and bottling works building for the brewery. In 1883, he deeded the house to Matthew Cullen for $15,000. Matthew lived there until his death in 1918. The home was then deeded to his wife Nellie. It stayed in the family until the 1960s, when it was sold to the Catholic Diocese of Salt Lake City. The diocese sold it in 1987, and it went through a few more owners. The home was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1999. It still stands today and is possibly the oldest remaining non-Mormon residence in the area. Now on to the brewery. As I mentioned before, it sat at what is now about 10th East and 500 South, on what was known as Brewery Hill. It spanned both the east and the west side of 500 South, with the brewery proper on the east side and the bottling works on the west. According to the Sanborn Fire Insurance map from 1889, there was an underground steam pipe from the brewery to the bottling works building, and also an underground tunnel between the two. This is the only map that shows these underground tunnels. Sticking with the 1889 Sanborn map, on the brewery side was a large 4-story brick building. It's the Gothic Revival architecture style that made this building so awesome. It was very reminiscent of a castle, complete with towers and battlements. I imagine it looked quite ominous sitting up there on that hill. This building housed the offices, storage, beer coolers, machinery, barley and malt storage, mash tub, steam kettle, and ice house. The 1911 Sanborn map shows the brewery had expanded with additions to the original buildings and some shifting of the areas within the building. The granary, malt, rice, and hop storage was moved to a new building behind the brewery, which left more room to increase the amount of beer being brewed. According to an article in the Salt Lake Democrat from June of 1885, Jacob invested $30,000 in the only ice manufacturing machine between Chicago and San Francisco in order to keep, and I quote, Salt Lake Brewing in the front rank of the procession, end quote. This machine would have kept a constant and cool temperature of the cellar, which contained over 100 oak casks, 3 tiers deep. The capacity of the cellar was 5,000 barrels or 160,000 gallons. In the same article, it was also noted the capacity of the company was estimated at 50,000 barrels a year, which breaks down to 1.5 gallons per week for every man, woman, and child living in the city. The brewery also shipped beer throughout the country, with an average of 5 carloads a week going out, and that's not counting the constant daily deliveries in the city. In November of 1885, Louis Borzig was killed, and Jacob Krause was critically injured by an explosion at the brewery. See, every fall they huge storing casks needed to be recoated in pitch, which is basically tree resin. And it was this process that led to the accident. An explanation of the explosion was reported in the Salt Lake Democrat and reads, quote, "When one of these monster casks is ready for a coat of pitch on the inside, superheated steam at 2,500 degrees is used to dry and char the inside of the cask. When this highly heated steam issues forth from a series of coiled pipes and is turned into the barrel, the side effect is the same as throwing cold water on a red-hot stove if the cask contains the least bit of moisture. This action is quick as dynamite and with terrible force, so was fatally exhibited yesterday," end quote. 7 or 8 other men were working on this cask when it exploded. Debris hit Borzig, crushing his skull, and he later died of his injuries. Jacob Krause was standing by watching, and he was also struck on the head. He was taken to Sisters Hospital, which I assume was Holy Cross Hospital, which is now Salt Lake Regional Medical Center, where it appears he recovered. The other men were all treated for minor injuries. Now, accidents weren't the only hazards of working at the brewery. Sometimes fellow workers were the problem. The Salt Lake Times so eloquently wrote about an act of attempted murder at the brewery in an article from December 23rd, 1890, and I have to read it to you. It reads in part, quote, "A diabolical effort to contribute another tragedy to the criminal annals was made at the Salt Lake Brewery shortly after 5 o'clock last evening, on which occasion John Dunkel was assailed by Henry Lebert with an iron bar and left before the jaws of the furnace, apparently in the endless sleep of death," end quote. Now that's some fancy wordplay. Apparently, Lebert lodged some complaints about Dunkel's work ethic. This did not set well with Dunkel, so he got revenge by hitting Lebert in the back of the head while he was shoveling coal into the furnace. Thinking Lebert was dead, Dunkel went on his way, but Lebert stumbled to his feet and reported the deed to the office, who called the authorities and took Dunkel into custody. By 1894, Salt Lake City Brewing Company was the largest manufacturer of beer west of the Mississippi, with an annual capacity of over 100,000 barrels. To put this massive production in perspective, in 2016, all the breweries in the state of Utah produced a combined total of nearly 200,000 barrels of beer. Jacob had an expensive Stockheimer filter through which all the beer passed before leaving the brewery, installed in order to have a product that rivaled breweries in Europe. Hops were even shipped in from Bavaria. In fact, in 1893, the shipment from Bavaria was the largest and most costly shipment of hops from another continent to date at that time. These hops were used to brew Würzburger, one of the most popular beers. They also brewed American Beauty, Pilsner, Lager, Export, and Porter. These were award-winning beers, and breweries across the nation knew all about the Salt Lake City Brewing Company. A 1903 Deseret News article stated that the brewery had a capacity of 500 dozen, or 6,000 bottles of beer per day. In the bottling house, empty bottles returned to the brewery were sanitized thoroughly before being refilled. Once refilled, bottles were corked and sent to the pasteurizer, which was a machine with 3 different compartments holding hot, warm, and cold water, to sterilize the beer and ensure it would keep in any climate. Now, Jacob Moritz wasn't just a brewery owner. He also owned 36 saloons that, of course, exclusively sold his beer. Aside from his businesses, he was also heavily involved in local politics. Now, you would think that owning a brewery and saloons would put Jacob on the outs with the local religious community. But not so fast. Jacob actually won some respect from this community in 1885 when he was thrown off a grand jury for refusing to prosecute 2 men for their involvement in polygamy. Now, if you listen to the episode about the Utah State Penitentiary, you know that prosecuting men for polygamy was huge in Utah in the late 1800s. So refusing to prosecute was a very big deal. Jacob served in the territorial legislature, and although he was a liberal, he joined the Republican Party in the early 1890s. Through the party, he was elected to the Utah State Constitutional Convention, where in 1895, a constitution was drafted for the state of Utah. In 1902, Jacob led the Republican ticket as a candidate to represent Salt Lake County in the state Senate. There were several newspaper articles in late 1902 that used the fact that Jacob manufactured beer, owned saloons, and that said saloons were not only in violation of the Sunday liquor law, which stated that no liquor was to be sold on Sundays, but also places of questionable and law-breaking behavior, that he clearly wasn't suitable for a Senate seat. In fact, a group of women drew up a petition to remove Jacob from the ticket, but abandoned their effort when they learned that he could not be removed without his own consent. Then there was the fact that he was running against Democratic candidate Simon Bamberger, a businessman and owner of Bamberger Railroad. Simon was also Jewish and also from Germany. As a side note, in 1917, Simon would become the first non-Mormon, Democratic, and as of yet, the only Jewish governor in Utah. So the comparison was made between the men in the press that Jacob made his living through unclean methods and bad moral judgment, while Simon was the proper example of a good man with upstanding morals. All of this ultimately contributed to Jacob losing the election to Simon Bamberger. Now, it was well known that these two men had a great disliking for each other, but I have heard stories that at some point they did put their differences aside and became friends before Jacob's death. In October of 1907, it was announced that Jacob bought property on 2nd South between Commercial Street, which is now Regent Street, and Plum Alley for $87,500. with the intention of tearing down the existing structure to build an up-to-date business block. Today, this is the empty lot at 45 East, 200 South. Jacob estimated the cost of the building to be about $400,000. At the time of the announcement, he wasn't sure if he would build an office building or a hotel with stores on the first floor. He was waiting until the present leases on the building expired before he made his plans. Unfortunately, this never came to fruition. Jacob passed away on June 9, 1910, at the age of 61, in Germany of stomach cancer. He and his wife had gone to Germany on the advice of specialists to take a course of baths to improve his health, but it was to no avail. His wife was willed the majority of his estate, valued at around $300,000. He was cremated in Germany and his ashes brought back to Salt Lake and interred in his now famous mausoleum. With the passing of Jacob, Matthew Cullen now controlled all aspects of the brewery, and he kept it going right up until August 1st, 1917, when Simon Bamberger, now governor, signed statewide prohibition into law. So what do you do with a brewery when it's illegal to brew beer? Well, Matthew decided that he would switch from brewing beer to making what was affectionately called near beer, or by its brand name, Necto, which was a non-alcoholic carbonated drink made from hops. An advertisement for Necto in the Salt Lake Herald Republican from July of 1917 promoted the drink in a large one-page ad that read, quote, "The new drink. After July 31st, we will place on the market throughout the Intermountain country our new beverage, Necto. The drink is delicious, dainty, and delightful, rich in food value and blood-building qualities, free from alcohol, and therefore non-intoxicating. Necto is a carbonated beverage made from a rare combination of finest selected materials. It has a tang that sharpens the appetite and is an effective aid to digestion. Necto is a drink that appeals to those who demanded a drink that looks good and tastes good. It has a beautiful light amber color and when poured creates a delicious creamy froth that never fails to please. It has hops flavor. On October 1st, we will place Necto on the market," end quote. It also appears that at this time, The name of the Salt Lake City Brewing Company was changed to Cullen Ice and Beverage Company. In September of that same year, Cullen Investments, of which Matthew was the principal owner, bought all of the Salt Lake City Brewing Company's assets. He planned to keep producing Necto and to also construct one of the largest wholesale and retail ice plants in the city on the site. In addition to Necto, the company also started brewing root beer, which might have been the first time root beer was brewed on a large scale, but I can't totally back up that claim. On February 27, 1918, Matthew Cullen passed away at his home at 941 East, 500 South of an unexpected illness at the age of 78. Now, in the spirit of connecting all my podcast stories together, Matthew's first wife, Emma Jane Thompson Cullen, was one of the founding members of the Orphans Home and Day Nursery. Listen to episode 2 for that story. Matthew is buried in the Mount Olivet Cemetery next to Emma, who passed away in 1889. It was announced in 1919 that the Cullen Ice and Beverage Company would start manufacturing candy. Necto only used a portion of the large brewery, and since the company was running in the red, it made sense to convert one of the buildings to manufacturing a new source of income. This new candy factory would be the most modern and complete in the United States. In December of 1919, the company celebrated the completion of the factory. Soon, chocolate and bars would make their way into the consumer market. In December of 1923, Cullen Candy was formally opened at the site. The company employed more than 100 people and manufactured over 500 different items, such as chocolates, hard candies, marshmallows, gummies, jellies, bars, and more. Unfortunately, by 1929, Cullen Candy announced the suspension of all operations indefinitely due to economic adversities. Just before midnight, on July 22, 1931, a fire broke out in the main structure of the old brewery. People lined the streets to watch the flames shoot into the air, punctuated by explosions and crashing of falling walls. It took nearly every piece of equipment in the city to extinguish the fire. By morning, just a mass of smoking debris was all that was left of the building. In late summer of 1936, the demolition of the buildings began to make room for a new road that would come to be known as 500 South. Workers, along with their foreman, Claude Harmon, went in search of 12 bottles of champagne that were supposedly put in the basement of the brewery by the late Matthew Cullen, and would have been about 65 years old. But the search was fruitless and the mythical champagne was never found. In an attempt to bring down the old buildings quickly, 2 dynamite blasts were set off without success. What is it with using dynamite to blow up buildings back in the day? If you remember from the Utah Territorial Penitentiary episode, this is also what they did to bring down the penitentiary walls. In 1937, the remaining buildings were condemned and ordered to be removed. A look at the Sanborn Fire Insurance map from 1950 shows no trace of the once grand brewery buildings. In its place is a road and apartment buildings. The bottling house, however, remained. The map shows that this building was now used as a furniture and upholstery factory and a wholesale kitchen warehouse. In the mid-1970s, the old Salt City Jail restaurant opened in the bottling building. The ambiance of an Old West jail where one dined in a jail cell led some to believe that the building had actually been an old jail. But now you know that wasn't the case. I had a very awkward blind date there once in high school, but that is a story for a completely different podcast. Today, the Anniversary Inn, a themed hotel room, occupies the site. The Salt Lake City Brewing Company name still prominently graces the front of this building. Now that you know the story of Jacob Moritz, I hope that if you ever find yourself in the Salt Lake City Cemetery, you'll go visit his grave and experience it in a much more meaningful way now that you know there's more to him than just the legend of emo. And while you're there, make a 180 and you'll see the grave of Simon Bamberger. Now, I certainly hope the stories of these men making amends before their deaths are true, because that would really suck to be buried across from your enemy for all of eternity. Don't forget to check out my Instagram and Facebook pages at Demolished Salt Lake Podcast to see some cool photos of the brewery as well as Jacob Moritz and his final resting place. If you're on Twitter, follow me at Demolished SL Pod. And if you like the podcast, please subscribe. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you soon.